What are chess nuances? Chess nuances refer to the strategic aspects of the game that help players make sound decisions. And although it is true that Chess Informant would be a good investment for you, Chess Informant is mainly specific to new trends and developments in well-established theory. And for an example, I will use the French defense to illustrate my point. After e4, e6, followed by d4 and d5. Both knight d2 and knight c3 are playable. You can capture or advance the pawn forward, but here, after the following moves, the continuation is d takes e4, knight takes e4, and what should black play? What about queen to d5, threatening the knight? Knight captures knight on f6 check, and after the recapture, white gets an extra pawn, and after rook to g8, queen f3, and now knight d7, threatening the bishop on f6. But there is a trade of queens first. And now the bishop can retreat. How many of you watching this video right now are familiar with this line and its continuation? As compensation, black gets a rook on the open e-file, activity for its pieces, a dark square bishop, a bishop that is open, and white is unable to castle here because the bishop would be hanging on e2. Okay, now let's get to the meat of the lesson. We're gonna start with the endgame first and work backwards. The position that you see on the board in front of you is an endgame. And what are the benefits of studying the endgame first? Well, we're going to take a trip to a chess college and see what a university professor has to say about the endgame.
Welcome to my class. Now I'm going to give you the ABCs of the endgame in chess.
A. Letter A. Mastering the complexities of endgames can be a crucial step for substantial progress in your chess. Letter B. Endgame studies can help you change your perspective on what's possible and impossible in chess. Letter C. Endgames have different strategic goals than other phases of the game. For example, in the endgame, a main goal is to promote a pawn. Letter D. The endgame teaches you how to make the most of your pieces. In this position, it is black to move. Pay attention to the pawn structures. A very instructional endgame. Black does well by capturing on c3, creating a weakness there. After capturing on c3, the plan is to double the rooks on the c-file. You create a weakness in your opponent's position and then you build on that weakness. Additionally, the fianchetto bishop on g7 eyes the pawn on e5. So the idea is called the principle of two weaknesses. The more weaknesses you can create in your opponent's position, the harder it will be for him to defend. White plays bishop to a6, hitting the rook, but rook over to a8 now attacks the bishop, and instead of retreating the bishop, White plays the rook over to f3. The idea is that if rook captures the bishop, then white will follow up with rook to b8, pinning the bishop. The answer to this is bishop to c7. However, white does not retreat the bishop, but instead challenges the rook on c5. And now rook c4. This tactical shot by black, avoiding trades, renews the threat of capturing the pawn on c3. Now that pawn will fall. And after, let's say, a few more moves, white resigned. Now let's go back to the middle game. After white plays the pawn to c3, the pawn chain is formed on the queen side, pointing towards black's king side. So the pawn structure for white indicates that white will attack on the king side, but will defend on the queen side. On the other hand, black will play the pawn from e7 to e6, and the pawn chain will run from f7 to e6 to d5, which means that black will attack on the queen side, but will defend on the king side. Here, white's bishop is on h3 because it refused to trade light square bishops with the opponent, which is good because white's light square bishop is a good bishop. But however, the good course of action for white here is to try and gain some tempo on the bishop on e4. The move here is f3, and after bishop f5, then g4, which gains another tempo. Bishop retreats, and now white will continue with the pawn to g5, gaining tempi.
Okay, well, what was the other option?
Well, I'm going to show you that, but first let's take the moves back. The other option was taken on c6 first. Knight captures knight on c6. And after queen takes c6, then white can follow up with f3. And actually can trade on f5. And now the knight from d3 can go to e5 with tempo. But the move played in the game was knight on f to d3. Okay, white trades off the bad bishop, and now e6. And as a result of white's move choice or continuation, black was able to achieve equality. And not only does black achieve equality, but after doing so, was able to also carry out the pawn assault on the queen side, starting with pawn to b5. And by beginning the pawn assault on the queen side, black poses the question to white, what are you going to do about the queen side pawn storm? And let's see how white replied. Bishop to d6 was the move played in the game. However, one option was pawn to b4, and after knight b6, knight to c5, knight c4, to set up like a barricade on the queen side. But however, after bishop to d6, then queen b6 threatens knight takes d4, and it works out for tactical reasons. So bishop to e5, and black just trades off one of the knights for white's bishop. Now from this point on, we arrive at our in-game situation where black captures on c3 and the weakness is created. Now let's go to the opening. Okay, now that we studied the end game, examined the middle game, and now we're at the opening. What opening is this? Now looking at the move order, you might automatically assume that this is a King's Indian defense. But the difference here in this opening is that the C pawn on C2 is delayed or isn't played at all. However, white can transpose by playing the pawn to c4 to a King's Indian defense. But in this game, actually after knight c3, black tries to exploit the fact that white refrained from playing the pawn to c4 and does this by playing the pawn to d5 himself, thereby gaining control of the c4 square. However, do not think that white doesn't intend to challenge black's pawn center. And white's idea is to undermine black's light squares in the center. Contemplating black's potential development of the knight on b8 to c6, white plays knight e2 with the plan of going to f4, hitting the bishop on e6. And now bishop f5, black intends to play the bishop to e4 in order to trade it off. Now remember, we looked at the endgame. We examined the endgame, and white had other options. Now bishop h3, avoiding the trade there. But after this move, the three options for white, that was the actual move that was played in the game. But the moves were either f3 or knight captures knight on c6 first, followed by pawn to f3. Thanks for watching. That is all I have. Stay tuned for my next video.